Hi, I'm Pam Demoff, the Member of Parliament for Oakville, North Burlington, and today I'm joined by Dr. Alan Drummond. Dr. Drummond is the past president of the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians, and for the last 20 years, he's been the Public Affairs Chair. Is that right, Dr. Drummond?
That's correct, yeah.
And we're going to be talking about firearms. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Drummond when he appeared as a witness at the Public Safety Committee. And he was invited back several times, not just on firearms legislation, but also when we were talking about rural crime. And I was just so impressed with the information that he was able to provide as someone who has worked in emergency medicine for a number of years and has actually seen what the impact of firearms can be on individuals and families. So Dr. Drummond, I just want to thank you for joining me, and we'll maybe start talking about your views on firearms. One of the things that when we talk about firearms, it always turns to guns and gangs and crime, and we don't talk about the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who die by firearms are actually dying by suicide. And you're the one that highlighted that for me. And also how we need to be reframing the conversation on firearms to a public health issue. So could you maybe give us a bit of information and your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me to chat. It's been an interesting. I've been a physician now for 42 years, and before I came to rural Perth, Ontario, I worked in Montreal and Ottawa and Vancouver, and I rarely saw actually a gun injury. And yet, when I came to Perth back in 1983, I saw a fair amount, and I was actually kind of shocked, actually. And it dawned on me that here I had been in 3 of Canada's major cities and rarely seen a firearm injury, and yet I come to rural Canada, and I'd seen within several years of establishing practice, I saw many actually, and they weren't actually hunting accidents. Quite often they were people using long guns for suicide, sometimes in an act of anger, and it kind of surprised me and increased my interest in where firearms sort of stood in Canadian society. In 1993, I was appointed a coroner for the province of Ontario. And that's when it became very apparent to me that guns were far more an urban crime problem, but more often a rural sort of suicide problem, because I saw a fair number of firearm suicides. Often with, in fact, I've never seen a handgun suicide in my 30 years as a coroner. Mostly long guns, either the hunting rifle, or the family shotgun, and so that quite sort of piqued my interest in where we were at. And there was some work done by a Quebec physician, Antoine de Chapdelaine, who published in the CMAJ talking about firearms as a public health issue, and really solidified for me that we need to get away. We need to broaden the lens in terms of a discussion of firearms injury and death in Canada, away from urban gangs and smuggled handguns, and talk about the broader context, which is quite wide, actually. You're absolutely right. Of all the firearm deaths in Canada, 75% of them are due to suicide, but there are also the use of firearms for intimate partner violence and intimidation of a partner, femicide. There's also the issue of pediatric unintentional injury from inappropriate storage of firearms in homes. There's also the issue of mass shootings. So we need to broaden the discussion from strictly talking about crime in downtown Toronto or Surrey or Edmonton, and start talking more broadly about how firearms impact on the health of Canadians. And it's a significant problem. It is a public health problem that needs a public health lens, which is less of a focus on police and enforcing laws and border security, but more a greater more emphasis on the context of inequity and racism in our society, and how it comes to pass that people have to pick up a gun, either in a criminal circumstance or even with respect to suicide. So broader issue which requires a different level of conversation, to be sure.
One of the things that you and I have spoken about before is that people will say, "Oh, well, taking the gun away, people will still find a way to die by suicide. They'll find a way, so it doesn't really matter if you take the gun out of that picture." And in fact, that's not true. Can you maybe expand on that?
So that's totally not true, and it's part of the mythology used by, I think it's fair to say, there's a pro-gun lobby in Canada. There are 2.2 million gun owners in Canada, including me, actually. But there is an active and aggressive pro-gun lobby, which to me kind of feels more like the NRA North than the reality of the average Canadian gun owner. The average Canadian gun owner follows the laws, goes hunting in November, maybe goes target shooting a couple of times a month, doesn't really think about all of this. But there's a really active pro-gun lobby, and that, where any discussion of a reduction of firearm morbidity or mortality seems to lead to a discussion of confiscation and threat and yada, yada, yada. And they are very big on this mythology of that suicide is inevitable. It's entirely not true. We know that suicide is largely an impulsive action, that people often decide to pick up the gun and pull the trigger either within minutes and certainly within an hour of the decision to be made. It's not the same level of planning that is required for, let's say, hanging or driving your car in front of a tractor trailer or overdosing by collecting pills from your physician. So it tends to be quite an impulsive act. And again, made within usually, and the science is very clear about this, usually the decision is made within about an hour. If you reach for a gun, there is no turning back. People do survive hangings. People do survive driving their cars into abutments. People do survive taking pills, but very few survive putting a bullet in their head. We also know that if people actually survive their initial attempt, at least 90% of them will still be living 5 years later. So this idea that suicide is inevitable is factually and scientifically incorrect, and therefore it does heighten the need to discuss, at least when we're talking about mental illness and suicide prevention, the concept of means reduction, which is taking away from the severely depressed individual or the psychotic individual the means actually to commit suicide. And so that's an important conversation that we need to have now. I mean, we talk about mental health in Canada. We have this Bell Let's Talk. There's all kinds of discussion about access to mental health services, which is all valid. And we need to destigmatize mental health. We need to increase our availability of psychological and psychiatric support for the severely depressed. But to be sure, taking away a gun from somebody who is contemplating suicide, severely depressed, psychotic, will save lives, and needs to be part of our ongoing conversation in Canada about the toll of suicidality, which is around 4,000 Canadians per year. And that's a lot of grief for a lot of families, a lot of individuals, and a lot of communities. And so it's worthy of addressing.
And that was a recommendation you made to the Public Safety Committee on Bill C-71, and we weren't able to amend that legislation. We did send it back to the House with a recommendation that the minister look at what are called red flag laws, right? And it was a campaign commitment, and I know Bill Blair has said that there will be firearms legislation. Can you maybe explain what that is and why we need those?
So it's not just Bill C-71. My colleague Harold Fisher from Mount Sinai, Toronto, appeared in front of the House of Commons committee and the Senate committee looking at Alan Rock's Bill C-68, which was the original gun control bill. And even back then, we were pretty clear. Besides our support for the registry, which we still think has value, there were a number of other issues that we thought were worthy of consideration. And one of those was certainly an increased scientific research base in Canada, with Canadian-based research on firearms injury and death, because we tend to rely on a lot of international studies and a lot of American studies, and they're not clearly translatable to the Canadian experience. But even back then, in 1994, 1995, we were talking about our experience as emergency physicians and how we encounter people in our emergency department who may be psychotic, may be severely depressed, may be expressing suicidal ideation, and how we are encumbered by the current circumstance and the current laws, that we cannot necessarily prevent them from fulfilling their suicidal wish. Now, if somebody is definitively suicidal, it's pretty straightforward. You know, we put them under a mandatory psychiatric evaluation order. They're sent to a psychiatrist, a psychiatric facility where they are mandated to be evaluated for a period of time, observed until the crisis has passed. But for everyone who comes in with a very clear plan, there are many, many people who come in with vague ideation, and we have to send them home. We don't have the right to remove their liberty. And at 3 o'clock in the morning in Perth, Ontario, or Red Deer, Alberta, or Fredericton, New Brunswick, we encounter somebody who comes in, they're depressed, they're kicking around the idea of suicide. We can't, because there's not a very clear plan or a very clear threat, we send them home. We send them home to an uncertain future. Mental health facilities and access to resources is limited. And so it may be 3 days, a week, a month before they get to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a mental health support worker. And we don't know if we're sending them home to a loaded shotgun in their closet or an armed arsenal in their basement. And so we've been talking about, for now close to 30 years, the ability for emergency physicians faced with a patient in mental health crisis to contact the local constabulary or police in a more immediate setting to say, look, you know, we're sending Mr. X or Mrs. Y home. We're concerned, but we don't have the ability to put them under a mandatory psychiatric evaluation order. It would be really nice if we could be sure that they would be safe until such time as there's mental health intervention, which may be a question of days or weeks. And wouldn't it be nice if we could have a mandatory reporting of individuals at risk, such that their firearms were removed until such time as evaluation and therapy had started. And that's been a 30-year request, and we've been very consistent, both with the Chrétien government, with the Harper government, with the current government, that this is where we think that there can be some positive intervention to reduce the tragic toll. Now, we were very surprised when Mr. Blair came out of a caucus meeting or a national meeting of Liberals in Winnipeg a couple of years ago and announced precisely that he was going to consider red flag laws. And we thought, well, this is fantastic. This is really, there can be no argument between either those of us that want to see stricter gun control or those that belong to the pro-gun lobby that this should be something we can all get behind. Now, the red flag laws have been, I believe he was sort of commenting on what was happening in America, where there are these extreme risk protection orders where somebody can be identified as at risk, and following judicial review, firearms can be removed from the home until such time as therapy has been initiated. We're thinking about something a little bit more direct, where if in an emergency department at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, we're sending somebody home, but we have concerns, that we could bypass the judiciary component to at least have those firearms removed until such time as therapy is initiated. That may be a bridge too far. The law kind of already exists to a certain extent. You have to understand that Canadian physicians are entrusted with the right to report a whole broad spectrum of people in society who are at risk, people who are unsafe to drive, people who abuse their elders, people who abuse children, pilots who are unfit to fly. So we already have mandatory infectious disease components. So we already have that power in legislation in Canada for other reportable conditions. It just makes perfect sense to me that that we should be able to report people who might be at risk of either mass shootings or suicide or homicide. So that makes sense. The law is actually already on the books in one Canadian jurisdiction in Quebec. Following the shooting in Dawson College, the Quebec government introduced Anastasia's law that allowed for mandatory reporting of individuals at risk of firearm malfeasance. And there has been in Canada, and I think probably in all provincial jurisdictions, a legal obligation for physicians to report directly from the emergency department to police agencies those who present with an already established gunshot wound, in the belief that somebody shot means that other individuals are at risk. So the judiciary isn't involved in that. That's the emergency physician directly to police agencies. So, you know, I think it's something seriously worthy of consideration, something that either, you know, whichever side of the equation you are with respect to gun control, that we can acknowledge that you know, suicide is an issue and that Canadian lives can be saved. The pro-gun lobby, if you could call them that, say, well, this is redundant. We already have a 1-800 number. Any Canadian can call the chief firearms officer in a province and report an individual at risk. And that's true. It's a 1-800 number. But the response time has been shown through RCMP audits that it can be quite substantially delayed. And we're talking about weeks before there's any assessment or intervention. And it certainly doesn't help, you know, me or any other emergency physician, you know, in the middle of the night when we're sending somebody home, in terms of, you know, do they have firearms? You know, could they enact their impulsive behavior and you know, just in a moment of desperation or alcoholism or what have you, reach for the gun and pull the trigger? And every Canadian life that can be saved as such is a life worth saving. So the total number is, I think, currently around 550 Canadians die by firearm suicide every year. And it is not inevitable. And in a lot of jurisdictions now, we're talking about trying for zero suicide. So anything we can do to reduce firearms access for those at risk, I think, you know, is something that we really as a society, seriously need to consider. Because suicide, I can tell you, as a coroner, as an emergency physician, who's somebody who's lived this experience, it's really tough. And it's really tough on the family, who then start second guessing themselves. It's a legacy of pain that lasts for generations. And it's a community impact as well. So, you know, any life saved from a gun suicide is worth the effort.
What are your thoughts on the assault rifle ban that Minister Blair brought in, and also the, you know, no legislation has been brought in yet, but there's been a lot of talk around how to deal with handguns. Do you have any thoughts on those ones?
Well, I do. I mean, I am a firearms owner, and I'm a responsible firearms owner. I'm also a Canadian veteran. So, and I live in a community where firearms are quite prevalent. Like every one of my neighbors has a firearm, and you know, Lanark County maleness disappears in November as they all go for hunting camp. And so I live in a community where we understand guns, and the great majority of Canadian gun owners are safe and they are respectful, and they have been educated well with respect to safety. But you know, Canadian society as a whole has changed, and I think when we talk about a public health approach, we also are talking about changing of societal norms. And I think public opinion poll after public opinion poll, for as long as I've been involved in this, which is now close to 30 years, Canadian society is less tolerant of firearms in their communities. They want the relationship with the gun changed, and I think that's exceedingly clear. It makes no sense to many Canadians that people need. I don't want to get into the semantics of what an assault rifle is, but I think Canadians don't need this fulsome discussion of what constitutes. They know what an assault rifle is, no matter what the gun lobby wants to say. They get it, and they don't understand the need for arsenals in people's basements, which could be subject to theft or misuse. Admittedly, mass shootings are rare, but they certainly impact the nation as a whole when they do happen. And so I think Canadian society is saying, like, enough. We get that people want to go hunting, but you don't need an assault rifle to go hunting. And if you do need an assault rifle to go hunting, then you're probably a lousy hunter and shouldn't be hunting in the first place. I think that Canadians think that they don't want to live in communities where somebody has 30 or 40 rifles in their basement. No matter how much of a collector the individual is, there's a community responsibility. I don't know about the Canada that some people live in, but my Canada doesn't need a gun for self-defense in any way, shape, or form. It just is foolish, and yet we hear that all the time. And we are influenced to a certain extent by NRA politics that may fund Canadian experiences with the pro-gun lobby, maybe not, but certainly they have adopted the rhetoric and the tactics of the NRA. So, I think it's time to change the attitude. I think it's time to accept what Canadians are saying, which is, the days of, hunting for your family and providing for your family. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent it happens, but let's be real. People do not go and, shoot 20 deer and feed their family venison every night. First of all, the family would reject that because venison's not that great. And so it's time, I think, that we acknowledge what Canadians are saying, which is, the days of the pioneer lifestyle, they're long since gone. And we want to see a restriction on these types of firearms. We want to see a restriction on assault weapons. We want to see a restriction on handguns. That's our expectation, and we expect our political leaders to follow through with that. Now, there's been a lot of attention paid, on the Liberal government's plans, but I look at it really as rather the beginning of a broad sweep of legislative changes. The talk now is about the ban, the buyback on assault rifles, the banning or restriction of handguns to gun clubs and that kind of thing. This is just the beginning of a broad sweep, I think, and I'm fairly confident that we're going to start talking about more than that, and we're going to start talking about the role of firearms in intimidation and intimate partner violence. We're going to start talking more about femicide. We're going to start talking more about access to firearms for people who suffer from severe mental illness and its role in suicide prevention. And we're going to start talking to a certain extent about how we prevent mass shootings, which are, again, rare, but they do happen in Canada. So give the government, give the minister his due. Realize that we're just in the beginning of a process of a reformation of the approach to gun access in Canada, and let's sort of see how this all plays out.
So I think
I just want to add
Hi, Alison.
I just joined.
Do you have are you able to turn your video on, or are you just by phone?
I'm just by phone at the moment, if that's all
okay.
right.
That's okay. Can I just introduce who you are? So Alison Irons is a former RCMP, firearms advocate who lost her daughter to femicide by a law-abiding gun owner. And you actually joined at a good time, Alison, just because Dr. Drummond and I have talked about a whole bunch of stuff, but we haven't talked a lot about intimate partner violence. So maybe if you don't mind piping in on that, if that's okay.
Well, one thing I want to say is that I don't have exact statistics for this year of COVID, but it certainly seems to me that the femicide and femicide by gun in particular appears to be up this year. There was the one on Salt Spring Island, for example. I'm aware there've been a couple in Alberta. So I'm deeply troubled by that. And I've been following some of these cases to try and track whether the guns used were illegally owned or legally owned, because my own belief is that most often the femicides are committed with a gun in the home, whether illegally or legally possessed. And that certainly seems to have been the case with the cases I've been monitoring. So for one thing, I was disturbed to hear that it's going to take 2 years for C-71 to be implemented. And I'm guessing some of that is related to technology change and regulatory change. But my own feeling about that is 2 years is an awfully long time to wait for those background checks to transpire. I read a statistic the other day that said that something like 99.4% of applications for gun licenses in Canada are approved, which is a very high number and seems to suggest that, as I had cited in my submission to Minister Goodale at the time, that the references are rarely checked, that references can be your mother or your best friend. So I'm disturbed that I had really hoped that change, Bill C-71, was actually going to address the issue partly of who should have a firearm in the first place.
Yeah,
so
and
that
I agree
concerns me
with you.
With respect to femicide.
Yeah, I actually have spoken to Minister Blair about that when I saw that it was going to be 2022, which is actually more than 2 years, because the bill actually passed in 2019. And you testified at the committee as well. I know I had the Y from Lethbridge appeared at Status of Women, and afterwards I was talking to them, and the ladies were saying, I asked them how many cases of the women that come to their shelter have been impacted by firearms in the home, and she said to me every single case. They had one instance where 3 kids, every time they heard a loud bang, dropped to their knees, and it was because the father would fire a warning shot, have them line up, put the gun in the kid's mouth, and threaten to shoot the children in order to get the wife to comply. Now, no one was ever shot in that home, but it was used, and Dr. Drummond, you mentioned that earlier about intimidation, where the gun wasn't actually used to shoot anyone, but it certainly struck fear into the entire family, knowing that firearm was in the home.
And I think that's a key finding in studies that have been done in rural homes. I've read, for example, in some of the American research, that even cleaning the gun in front of the woman and the children is another way of threatening. It's a subtle form of threatening. The Lionel Desmond case in, I think it was New Brunswick, Alan, wasn't it? The prior armed forces.
Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia. I mean, he killed his children. He killed the wife and the children.
Yeah.
And it's all too often that's happening. Pam, I don't know if you and Alan touched on this. The other thing I was hoping to bring forward today, if we're talking about gun violence as a public health issue too. I think one thing that's seriously lacking, unless I'm unaware of where it may be being tracked, is the cost per incident of gun violence of healthcare. And I know in the United States, they've actually come up with a figure of $145,000 US for immediate treatment of a gun violence victim. So when you convert that to Canadian dollars, it still doesn't sound like very much, but that doesn't even begin to address long-term emotional, physical, and mental health issues for victims and survivors and their families. So
totally,
I honestly believe that part of our argument is to start to quantify and track that somehow.
Yeah, no, that's true. So Alison, can you maybe, if you're comfortable, explain what happened in your family?
Well, Lindsay, you mean what happened to Lindsay?
What happened to Lindsay? Yeah.
Well, Lindsay had an on and off again relationship with a boyfriend who seemed to be, he was from a professional family, a beautiful home, articulate, clean cut, a licensed hunter. They were a rural family that had hunting in their history. She was aware that from time to time the family spoke of issues with him, but what the issues were never clarified. He was 31 years old and still living at home with his parents, but he had an explanation for everything. And Lindsay was a very trusting, compassionate sort, and believed what she saw and how he represented himself to her. But after about a year in that relationship, she caught him drug dealing and broke it off. And he was able to lure her back with promises of change and that he would get a serious job and get his own apartment and so on. So he lured her back. And then at Christmas, she caught him the second time in their relationship, she caught him drug dealing again. So she broke it off for good. And by this time, she was going to university up in Bracebridge. They had a small campus at Nipissing University up there. At one point, he phoned her about a year before her death and threatened suicide over 3 hours. And she called me immediately the next morning, and I actually phoned his parents as an ex-RCMP officer and told them what had happened and told them he needed emergency medical attention. And they disputed that and said just because he says he's going to do it doesn't mean that he will. And I outlined for them exactly the method he said he was going to use when he was going to do it, and that he had made plans to give away his dog. So all of the signs and indicators of suicide were there, and buy a firearm in their home, and they just dismissed that. They didn't believe me. Then about the tragic thing was, Alan, if you can believe this, in about June of the following year, she'd had no contact with him, and he contracted a nearly fatal meningitis, and he nearly died. And his best friend contacted her to say, you know, I think you should go and see him because he's on the brink of death. And she and I had a long talk about that. And eventually the family called her that night and said, come down to the hospital. They don't expect him to make it through the night. And he recovered. So after he recovered, he had some deficits. And Lindsay, being a trained professional caregiver of people with disabilities, tried to explore with him. She tried to help him rehabilitate, and then tried to see if they explored whether they could have a relationship again. But by Christmas, she was fed up with his control and manipulation. The strange thing is he'd never been violent with her to that point, never physically violent, but very manipulative and controlling. So she broke it off New Year's weekend and came home and said, Mom, I'm absolutely done with him. It's over, and blocked him from everything. And then what I've come to realize later is that we did not realize the degree to which his anger towards her was escalating in that time for having broken off the relationship once and for all. And he knew once she graduated university that year that he'd lost her forever. And she actually had a plan to go to school in Windsor, where in the Windsor, Detroit area, she'd be able to hide from him with a very common last name. And the campus in Bracebridge was very small. It's a small university campus of only about 200 students. We thought his driver's license was suspended because of the meningitis. And he actually drove up there about a week before and found her car at the school, and was able to stalk her to where she was living. He didn't know that because she was renting a room in a house, so we had no idea where she was living. And he went back to Kingston having found out where she lived. And on the Friday morning, he drove up in the wee hours of the morning. He still had a license, with 2 guns in the car, and followed her around that day, and then hid on the back deck of the home where she was living, and waited for her to come out of the house, and confronted her in the driveway and shot her at close range with a shotgun, and mortally wounded. I mean, the paramedics attended, but she died about 20 minutes later at the hospital. They did try to save her life, and he took his own life. And I hesitate to say I'm not at all troubled by that, frankly. I should be, but I don't feel any forgiveness or empathy for him. And I found out later, I pursued it with the OPP for 4 years because I was very angry with the very cursory investigation that they did. They treated it as, of course, as a murder-suicide, so there was no one in custody and no one awaiting trial. But they did a very sloppy job, and I took them to task for it and became the adversary. And ultimately, I was able to write to the commissioner of the OPP and acquire another 100 hours of investigation of her death. Because I actually, at the time, was trying to have the parents charged with criminal negligence. It turned out that about 3 weeks before she died, he had told his parents that he had threatened her. And she didn't tell me because she knew I'd go berserk and move her out of school. And he told his mother that he had threatened my daughter, and the OPP hid that from me for 4 years. And that the parents told no one. They did nothing to remove the guns. They didn't warn me. They didn't warn Lindsay. They didn't call the police. So it was just all in all,
and you know,
disastrous
Alison,
situation.
Lindsay did nothing wrong, and her story is sadly quite a common one, right? Where
I know.
Where you know, it's she did nothing wrong, and the fact that she went back to him and that she was stalked. And I know you've become a very effective and vocal advocate on far too many situations, just like your daughters. And
thank you, Pam.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it's really quite. I really appreciate you sharing that story, because you know, I know it's not easy for you, and it's your daughter that you're talking about, and I know it's you're just such an effective advocate, Alison, and I think we all, I know I certainly do, appreciate the fact that you do speak out, and just like Dr. Drummond, I think your voices are so important in this conversation when we talk about firearms, that we don't let it get obscured by voices in the pro-gun lobby that are trying to focus only on crime and not talk about people like Lindsay and you know, people who are dying by suicide, and you know, we need to keep the focus on a public health aspect.
And I think, if I may, the one key point that I overlooked there, Pam, and Alan probably heard me testify to this at some point as well as you, but what was key to me and why I worked so hard on C-71 was that he had actually hidden, and this is why I went to Mark Holland in the first place, he had actually hidden a criminal record for personal violence as an adult from my daughter. He had an adult criminal record for forcible confinement and assault of another male related to drug trafficking. And he'd had an arrest for drug trafficking 7 days before that incident, which was, I think, folded into the plea bargain. And yet the minute he got off probation, his parents got him a very good lawyer. And so he plea bargained those charges down, because originally there were about 5 criminal charges, according to the police. And the minute he got off probation, he was able to apply for a gun license and got it. And my question to Mark was how, and to the committee, SECU, was how on earth did someone in Canada with a criminal record for adult personal violence, forcible confinement, and assault related to drug trafficking ever get a gun license in the first place?
Yeah.
And there's this mythology in Canada, especially among the gun lobby, that nobody who ever commits a crime can get a gun license in this country, and it's simply not true.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, Pam, because one thing that frosts me no end is that media and the police never report publicly on when a legally owned gun is used. So I'm working with Police Souvien right now on charting the ones I've been tracking, and I've actually phoned reporters. I phoned the reporter in Penticton that was covering the Britain case and said to him, do you know if a legal gun was used? Because that case, Britton pled guilty 2 weeks ago. He shot the 4 neighbors who were seniors.
Yeah.
And from the very beginning, they said that was a rifle. And I was sure that in Penticton, BC, with a rifle, it was a legally owned gun. But the media never reported on that. So the reporter got back to me and said, I don't know. And I said, well, if he's pleading guilty, it's going to be read in the statement of facts into court by the prosecution. So it's a matter of public record. So why isn't it reported on? So fortunately, the reporter did get back to me and confirm that. So I'm tracking those now, but Polly and I are making a chart of all of those that we've been tracking recently where legally owned guns are used. And I just don't understand. It almost appears as a conspiracy between the police and the media never to report on when it's a legally owned gun.
Well, I think part of the problem is that, and the reason we're having trouble with the public discourse, I think, in Canada about guns, is that the Canadian public only reads, frankly, media reports about guns used in crime. And so if you read the papers, and I read every Canadian daily every night, but if you read the papers or the social media platforms for the news agencies, it's all about, urban gangs. Suicides are not reported really in Canada, very rarely. Sometimes if a police officer commits suicide with a gun, it'll be reported. But for every firearm death in Canada related to criminal activity, keeping in mind that not everybody is a hardened criminal. You only become a criminal when you use the gun inappropriately sometimes.
Yeah.
But for every one of those firearm deaths, there are approximately two firearm suicides, and they aren't reported. So
That's right.
The media leads us into a kind of a box of guns as strictly a crime issue, and not necessarily, the broader context of the excess number of firearm suicides. And I understand why, because there's a lot of discussion amongst journalists about whether they should report suicides. There's always fear of inciting copycats.
And it's a privacy issue when it's a suicide, Alan, right?
No,
there's a privacy issue they claim.
True enough, but we have to acknowledge, though, that our public discourse is governed by what's available in the media, and the media is skewed towards criminal activity. And as you say, they don't even think about whether there should be a discussion of, is it a legally acquired firearm or not? That's just not part of the that's not part of their thought process. So we are governed by a media which is focused strictly on criminal activity, and that's kind of put blinkers on, I think, on the public discourse around where guns fit in Canadian society, in part.
Well, and in fact, Pam, the other thing I've followed fairly closely is that out in Alberta, where there's been a femicide, I think it was the Edmonton police decided about a year ago that they weren't even going to release the name of the victim in a femicide, let alone the method. And there's been quite an outcry about that in Edmonton from women's groups, because they're saying the public has a right to know. And if that person, the woman killed, was a member of the community, people have a right to know. So that's been quite controversial. And the other aspect of it that really bothers me is that many police have no vested interest in disclosing that piece of information, because many of them are gun enthusiasts. So to my way of thinking, though, police forces should be collecting that data, and somehow it should be being picked up by StatsCan.
So part of the problem is that
StatsCan
is really not. Too much emphasis is placed on StatsCan, and we frankly need a more robust Canadian research program on all the broad aspect of firearm violence. Now, you talk about intimate partner violence. There is some data, and it's important data, and it's 20 to 30% of women who present to a Canadian emergency department, if questioned, will report some degree of intimate partner violence. Every 6 days in Canada, a woman is murdered by her partner. More than half of these female homicides are perpetrated by partners, and more than half of these involve firearms. We know that the risk of death to a victim of intimate partner violence is significantly higher when there is access to a firearm in the home, and a firearm in the home increases a woman's risk of death 5-fold. And that rural women are particularly vulnerable to homicide by firearms, and rifles and shotguns appear to be the weapon of choice in 62% of spousal homicides. So, you know, that's another thing, another component of firearms violence in Canada that frankly does not get enough attention.
No, and one of the problems that I know I've run into is that a lot of that data is done by province. So, you know, the Ontario Coroner's Death Review Panel, and so trying to compile all of that and bring it all together, it seems that there's a need for some federal leadership on that to try and bring that data together and make sure that it's comparable and actually getting the data. And so I think I'm going to end it there, though, because we've been at this for almost an hour.
I'm sorry I joined you late. I had elder care this week. My mom broke her arm badly, and so I missed the new meeting notice.
That's okay. That's okay, Alison. It's been wonderful. I just want to thank you both, not just for joining me today, but for your advocacy on this issue. And I think it's been a really important conversation. So thank you so much.